it is more work to try to make all of these tanks consistently viable in 5v5 in a harder format to do it than it would be in 6v6. It just would be. Like, how are we talking about completely reworking Zarya or Reinhardt? Look at how ridiculous this conversation has gotten. All right, this one is for Coach Mills, our channel manager. We're reacting to debunked Samito's counter-swapping argument. Now, we'll see how this video goes. I don't really know what to expect going into this, but we'll take a gander here. Let's see what we got.
How does it work?
Oh, it's very simple. Scissors cuts paper, paper covers rock, rock crushes lizard, lizard poisons Spock, Spock smashes scissors, scissors decapitates lizard, lizard eats paper, paper disproves Spock, Spock vaporizes rock, and as it always has, rock crushes scissors.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
That's where I am.
So, this is the first and maybe only episode in a new debunked series where I thoroughly and objectively break down the argument a content creator puts forth in order to provide the audience and the content creator themselves some food for thought, as well as maybe getting on the Group Up podcast one day to further debate these ideas, but that's probably never going to happen, alongside actually using my degree that costs $9 grand a year, but hey, that's by the by. This one is a response to Samito's video explaining why Overwatch 2 or 5v5 will never work through the lens of counter-swapping. It's a 20-minute video reacting to a game that Flats had on Junkertown, where seemingly the game was just the tank swapping back and forth constantly. Well, Sam didn't have a...
So I do want to say real quick, like, my take is not that 5v5 will never work. It's just that it won't be better. That one, like, I don't do, like, my channel titles or thumbnails or anything like that anymore. Like, it's Coach Mills manages all of it because obviously, excuse me, I'm spread all over the place right now with Mindplex. But, yeah, my take is not that 5v5 won't work. It's just that it's not better.
Scripted breakdown because he was reacting to it on stream, there were still some great parts that articulated what Flats was going through and the whole issue of rock, paper, scissors type counter-swapping. I actually want to take a slightly different approach here. I'm not going to actually deny that counter-swapping exists. I think Samito is absolutely right when he says that dropping the off-tank means it's harder to mitigate the tank-on-tank matchup. And I also think Sam is right in saying that even if you do mitigate it, or if you can mitigate it, it ultimately makes the game less fun.
Like, tanking in this game is definitely less fun than it was in Overwatch 1.
As a result, I'm going to boil down Sam's argument, or the counter-swapping argument, to two simple premises. Premise 1, tank counter-swapping is one way that makes Overwatch less fun. Premise 2, tank counter-swapping is an issue specific to 5v5 and not 6v6. And the conclusion is pretty simple, therefore, one way to make Overwatch more fun is to leave 5v5. Now,
so, like, again, counter-swapping was still a thing in 6v6, right? It just, like, it did not give you nearly as much direct value for your pick than it does now, right? And I've always been a big advocate that what made Overwatch so great, especially in the glory days, there was a lot of room for error in that, like, it wasn't so much about what you picked, but more so how you played aside from the egregious metas. And October 2020 was the best example of that, where you would see even Diva Hog in some ranked games, like just some crazy stuff, and you could make it work. Like, Nathan and I used to log Zarya Hog and Quick Play all the time and go meat grinder, like, ult combos against, like, double shield comps and whatever it may be by cycling our stuff together. And that was really, really fun, and it was just enjoyable in general. So yeah, I think Overwatch is a better game. Like, you can pick into advantages and make the right pick, but, like, it just rewards you far too much now, and it's way too forced, and it takes the experience out of the player's hands and puts it in the game's hands, which is what you don't want to do with characters.
Now, I'm not going to be too semantic here, but that's the general gist of the argument, and Samito, if you're watching, I hope I didn't misrepresent what you're saying, because this is actually a pretty good argument. While it isn't logically valid, a process which, as a philosophy student, I'm not going to bore you with, as you'll see, it's still a pretty tough argument to crack, at least on the surface. Now I'm going to look at each premise and then delve into my own arguments. So the first premise, tank counter-swapping is one way that makes Overwatch less fun. And I think the good news for Samito here, at least for now, is that I agree. I think the foundation for this point stems from Overwatch being a better game when it's about how you play instead of what you play. This is because how you play is significantly more dynamic and interesting, rather than just picking a character like you're plugging in a formula to a math equation.
Yeah, and more importantly as well, like, it's just like, it's in the player's hands, right? Like, you want the player's experience to be in their control as much as possible, right? You don't want the game to force players to do things, especially a game that has so many characters like Overwatch. Like, people want to do what they want to do, right? And if the game is switched into a way where they're forced to do other things consistently, especially for the tank role when all that pressure is still on one player, it's just a recipe for disaster, right? And even the devs even acknowledge this themselves.
Samito alluded to this in the Flats video, where Flats and the enemy tank kept sitting in spawn and swapping between tanks back and forth on Junkertown thirds. And I have to agree.
Let's see what happens next. He went Diva. It goes Zarya. Look at this. Look at this. Look at this. They just keep swapping.
No, I got this, dude.
They just keep. This is the.
Guys, keep winning.
They're just capping. Look at this. Look at where the cart went. His team got to a free fight win because the cart pushed around the one fight territory to win. You win the round in one fight, right? His team got a free fight win because the optimal strat for the tanks was to play chicken in spawn and continuously swap heroes. That is how, like, that is insane. Anybody who tries to tell you that that's a better gameplay experience is talking out of their ass.
Now onto the second premise. Tank counter-swapping is an issue specific to 5v5 and not 6v6. Now how could I possibly reject this? Well, on the surface, it doesn't seem possible. Counter-swapping and the rock, paper, scissors stuff is a phenomenon.
And let me rephrase, like, there were optimal swaps to make as a tank in 6v6. There were, right? But it was much more forgiving, and there was a lot more player agency in, like, what you decided to pick based on how you played, right? Aside from double shield, which even against double shield, there were still options. It was really hard. Double shield was just brain dead easy, and they never fixed it, right? But yeah, no, it did happen in 6v6 too, but there was just so much more room for error there, and like it was way more fluid. It was way less forced on the player.
Phenomenon that has only emerged in the era of Overwatch 2. I couldn't have made that Big Bang Theory meme, for example, in 6v6. Now, I think where people go wrong is that they say, oh, but 6v6 had its issues like double shield. And again, Samito addresses this concern by saying that double shield is a fixable balance issue, which I agree with.
Like, tanking in this game is definitely less fun than it was in Overwatch 1, outside of double shield, outside of one meta that had overtuned broken characters that were strong enough to transition into 5v5 by themselves, right? Of course that's going to ruin tanking, right?
And not to mention, that doesn't actually refute the premise at all, it's just a different argument. Instead, I want to focus on the word issue and the assumptions behind it. In other words, does counter-swapping even need to be an issue in the first place? Or basically, is counter-swapping an issue that is actually fixable? If so, how fixable is it? Because if you can fix counter-swapping, then it's no longer an issue, and this premise falls apart. So now the gates are open, and here's why I present my two arguments that focus on this premise. The first argument is what I'd like to call argument from design. In other words, just as how Samito argues that double shield is a fixable balance issue, I'm going to argue that counter-swapping is a fixable hero design issue. And not just that, I'm going to argue that hero design is a more fixable issue than balance. The second argument is what I'd like to call argument from composition. In other words, tank counter-swapping can be mitigated by counter-swapping onto the other roles to form a composition that overall beats the other composition even if the tank you play is suboptimal. As a result, this means that tank counter-swapping is no longer an issue. There's also a third argument at the end, which is just an evaluative argument. Basically, this would be me agreeing that Samito's argument is right, but it just doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. As any good philosopher would, I'm going to consider counters to my own arguments, even things that Samito might raise himself, and then counter those counters and explain why they might be good or bad.
I don't really get what he means,
so let's not waste any more time, starting off with the design arguments. Premise 1. Counter-swapping with regard to tank means that some tanks have little flexibility with how they can be played. Premise 2. Some tanks do actually have little flexibility with how they can be played. Premise 3. This lack of flexibility can be fixed through hero design. Conclusion, therefore, counter-swapping is no longer an issue. The first two premises...
Okay, but now, and this is where I can tell where this is going to go already. If you're going to argue through hero design, that means you need to make heroes that have no weaknesses. Again, like, it's going to mean more tanks like Mauga and less tanks like Reinhardt, right? We'll see where he goes with it. But again, then now you've lost your ability to design unique characters in the game, and you can't have specialists in the tank role, which again, the heroes having unique identities in Overwatch is what made the game so awesome. And Chips have kind of talked about this too. It's just the generalization of every hero in the game. And I don't think that makes for better hero design. It limits your hero design, meaning you have to make more one-dimensional characters that can only fit one style of a gameplay loop. And that's just way more boring of a game.
Are basically the same, but I'm just doing that to link my argument back to counter-swapping. I think those two premises are fairly self-explanatory. We look back at that Flats game, and we can clearly see at points that in certain matchups, there isn't really much flexibility with how you can play. A good example of this is the Doomfist Hog matchup. I've explained the poke dive thing a lot with my spar framework and my spar graph, but in short, the Doomfist wants to take as little damage as possible before the dive, get a big spike of pressure when he's actually diving, and then get out scot-free. However, in these three stages, Hog pretty much denies all of that. He can poke out the Doomfist beforehand, he can absorb the dive with his hook and his breather, and even if Doom survives, he's not going to be living for long. So what do you do here as Doomfist? How do you outplay this? Again, I think it would be wrong of me to go all theoretical and say do X, Y, or Z, because even if there were solutions to this, it doesn't make the game fun, which refers back to that first premise of Samito's original arguments. Instead, this leads me on to my third premise in this argument, that this issue of not having that many dynamic playstyles is a fixable issue through hero design. Before I get into any specific ideas and examples, this point was initially raised or echoed by Coach Osi, a tier 2 contenders coach, and probably the biggest coach on TikTok, who pointed out that tanks who have less extreme strengths and weaknesses, like Ramatra, have turned out to be healthier for the game as a whole, compared to people like Malga.
The reason this is an issue is because there isn't another tank to balance things out anymore. Reinhardt D.Va used to be super good for brawl compositions, and Reinhardt would deal with the frontline situation while D.Va would control high grounds and work flankers or look for off angles. Now, I actually think a hero like Ramatra is a step in the right direction. He can be played in a lot of different circumstances, and you really can't hard counter Ramatra, right? Malga, on the other hand, is absolutely terrible in terms of this 5v5 tank flaw, right? He is almost too good in certain situations, to the point where you need to swap when playing against him. But it's also super easy to shut him down the moment he can't do the thing that he's good at anymore. I know a lot of players aren't going to like my solution, but I honestly think it's the best solution. And that's that we need to make tanks more similar to each other and reduce the amount of extreme strengths and weaknesses. That design...
Which means you are heavily limited in how you can design new heroes. What made Overwatch such an amazing game was how unique each character could be. And there were a million different ways to play the game, right? But as time has gone on, the game has gotten watered down more and more and more, becoming more and more one-dimensional, losing more of those special identities that made Overwatch stand out as an FPS game, right? This is what the 5v5 format creates. From a foundational level, you are significantly more limited in how you can design characters. You are forced to design a more one-dimensional, boring game. I don't think that's better. I don't. I like the unique identity different characters had. It made for so many different matchups and different things that you could do and different ways you could play the game, not pick heroes, right? And that's a big reason why 5v5 will always be inferior to 6v6 from a gameplay loop, right? Just look at how these heroes have to be designed. And I think this coach is right about Ramatra. I think Ramatra is a really fun character to play. He's really, really cool. I'd love to play him in a brawl comp in 6v6, dude. It would go so hard, right? And it'd be pretty easy to transition to 6v6 too. You could just lower his shield health and reduce the amount of damage that he negates from blocking, right? Reduce some of those stats, increase a cooldown or two, and then it's fine, right? Give him some downtime. You know, so again, like, this is a very, very solid point here. I'm going to let it keep going.
Philosophy would reduce the prevalence of counterpicking and would generally improve the game experience, especially for your average player.
Osi mentions Reinhardt in this clip, and I think proponents of 6v6 seem to have forgotten that Reinhardt got an entirely new playstyle in 5v5 because of his pin. Not only was Reinhardt flexible enough to be your traditional brawl tank, but even in ranked environments, he became viable to one-trick if you mastered the so-called die-fought playstyle, and I've personally coached Reinhardts who have played in lobbies against people like LH Cloudy.
Ryan did not get a new playstyle. That's always been there. That became the only playstyle Ryan can have because his kit is not designed well enough to stand up to the new tanks. He doesn't have the strength to match up any head-to-head. So now as the original brawl tank of the game, you now have to play this ratty playstyle to climb. That's not fun. That's not what got people to fall in love with the character to begin with. So instead of sticking to the core philosophy of characters that people loved, we're now trying to force a square, force a round peg into a square. It's not going to work. And so this is why I'm saying, like, Blizzard needs to make this decision now and ask themselves, right? And you can go back and look at their announcement of 5v5 where they say, yeah, there's a lot of problems that we're going to have to solve that they have not solved, that are unsolvable. You can't solve them with balance, right? And the irony is the pro 5v5 people are going to sit there and they're going to say, oh, well, just rework the old heroes into the new ones. But when you say, hey, like, let's go back to 6v6, it'll be a lot easier. They say, oh, well, then they'd have to rework all the heroes to go back to 6v6. It wouldn't work. What? It would be easier to change the 5v5 tanks to fit into 6v6 than it would be to completely destroy the identities of characters that people loved in a game that was already received well. What are we doing? Right? Queen Shout no longer applies overhealth to team. Wow got cardiac overdrive, only works on himself. Ramatra. What do? Lower his shield health as well as either reduce the amount of damage he blocks so he can actually die through his block and it helps him mitigate damage but isn't absolute like it has to be right now. It's easy. It's literally one patch instead of redesigning entire characters that people fucking love. It's so silly. So Ryan did not gain playstyles. that became the only style of Rein that was remotely viable, because there's no longer a tank exchange that matters on the front line, because tanks have gotten so powerful with their health pool and their cooldowns because they have to be with the solo tank, and the experience still feels bad. It still feels terrible. So it's just such a silly conversation.
And this is one of the things that keep coming up. Even Winston gaining a little bit more range with his right click. It seems small and marginal, but this helps Winston land those 130 damage bursts on entry to a dive, and any small bit of right click damage before the fight helps fund his primal.
It's really useful when they go Bastion Torb and all these other things that just make Winston explode. Like that right click did absolutely nothing, and like you can just go ask so many Overwatch League players and literally anybody who just plays Winston, it's like, how often do you actually use that right click and have it be like remotely meaningful? And it's almost never.
So what about that Hog Doom example? Well, I actually think the hero design flaw is on the Roadhog and not the Doomfist. I've coached a tier 3 Doom one-trick team for the past year, and we've played against a billion different teams and a billion different heroes, and the one constant we've always kept is the Doomfist. In other words, Doomfist has enough playstyles to alternate between when playing against different comps on a variety of different maps. Hog, on the other hand, has historically been reliant on his one.
Doom can just choose his duels well, is the thing. Like, he can always slam it. Like, if you're going up against Hog or Orisa, like, the only thing you can't do is just power block in front of them when they have spear or hook, and as long as you don't do that, like, you can still play into them.
Shots. And before the DPS passive, he was an issue because of how unkillable he felt. The solution in my eyes is simple: reduce the guy's range, damage, and or sustain, and give the guy either mobility or utility. I've talked many a time before about that experimental card where Hog drops a cloud of healing and damage reduction, which I think would be pretty good against dive heroes. And this would give Hog, and frankly the entire lobby, way more dynamism. The enemy dive team.
Oh, so you mean Cardiac Overdrive, the ability that already exists in the game. Again, like, this just forces more one-dimensional hero design where all tanks can only do one thing, and it removes a ton of unique identities from the game. You are not better off designing tanks in 5v5. You are more limited, despite what everybody said at the start. Congratulations, you've now made every character the same. It removes a ton of skill expression from what made Overwatch a fun and unique game. It's not the path forward. It's just not.
Team now have to make a risk-reward play on whether to commit to the dive or leave, and Hog's counterplay is no longer locked to whether he just hits the hook or not. This damage reduction AoE thing could have even been a throwable like his trap, or maybe it applies to a single target, or maybe Hog needs LOS to his supports to be able to apply this sort of effect, so he can't just run around wherever he wants to. In terms of his hook, I think reducing the range on it and or the projectile speed is not only the easiest solution, but the best solution too. This means that Hog can still flank, but he needs to take more time and more risk if he wants to hit that juicy hook. Reduce Hog's sustain a tad bit, and all of a sudden, you've now designed a flexible, short to medium range brawl hero that has the flexibility to absorb dives while threaten brawl heroes up close. But what about playing Hog into Ana Zen? What about playing Hog into poke compositions? And that is a valid point. Relf recently made a good video about how poor tank feels this patch, and how, at least for the average player, tanks feel miserable to play because in average ranks, tanks are absorbing all of the support utility in combination with the DPS passive. As a result, people counter swap to dive tanks or Sigma where they can avoid or absorb this influx in utility and damage. This is an absolutely valid point, but I think it's less related to the specific tank on tank matchup or the rock paper scissors stuff, which is what I'd like to keep the scope of this video within, but these issues instead are stemming more from the support and the DPS passive rather than inherent 5v5 issues. The last tank I'll go over in terms of design is Zarya. Malga I've already made a video on, and frankly every single content creator has, so I'm not going to rehash old grounds. But I think Zarya needs some hero design changes too. We look at when Zarya was at her peak in Overwatch 2, which was last year's playoffs patch, and she still wasn't played unless your name is Dallas Fuel. That has to tell us something about Zarya's inherent design, which is to do with her survivability. She can do a fuck ton of damage and enable a team like nobody else, but on the flip side, she herself is extremely squishy and has basically no mobility. Of course, you could just give her more HP, but then we're going into like a Malga kind of territory where you have infinite sustain and insane damage. Instead, I think mobility is the smarter option. In other words, I would put forth that when Zarya's last bubble pops, she gains a movement speed bonus. This all of a sudden...
Are we serious? These heroes are fine. They've been fine for 8 years, right? I'm not trying to flame him here, but do you see how ridiculous this conversation is getting? At what point are we going to say, yeah, it's the format? At what point? This is my entire point. Why are we trying to rework fan favorite heroes that worked for 7 years to fit this format that was for a game that needed a marketing ploy to be a new game, right? That the devs themselves, and you can go back and look at the VOD, said, yeah, there's a lot of problems we're going to have to solve, but we don't really know what we're doing yet. Imagine if a bank said, yeah, we're going to invest all of our money, all of our chips into this one new investment, and we haven't really done our risk management on it. We don't know it. There's very clearly like 3-4 major problems here, and they list them off. They literally list it. They say, yeah, there's a lot of pressure on one person, like, you know, it just doesn't feel fun to get hit by cooldowns. Is double main healer too strong? They list every issue, and I'm going to make it in my tanking video, okay? Imagine if a bank put all the money in that, and then and then it goes bankrupt. And it's like, okay, well, where's the risk management here, right? This is my point. This is the turning point, guys. We are now 2 years into Overwatch 2. 5v5 tank experience has not been solved, and it will never be solved. The heroes that are going to come out have to be all or nothing, and it's way more about what you pick rather than what you play. It is more work to try to make all of these tanks consistently viable in 5v5 in a harder format to do it than it would be in 6v6. It just would be. Like, how are we talking about completely reworking Zarya or Reinhardt? Look at how ridiculous this conversation has gotten. We need to take a step back and make a firm decision. This is absurd.
Now
This
give
is the
Zarya
point.
tons of dynamism. If, for example, she's hunting down 2 supports and her last bubble pops, she now has to make a risk-reward play. She can use the movement speed to leave and live another day.
And now, like in Overwatch 1, what made tanking so beautiful, right? If Zarya just gets that speed boost for free, right? For literal free, it takes away from the player's decision-making. It's now the game helping the player do it for free because the player can't make the right decision. What was beautiful about Overwatch is that it was about the player's decision, not the game automatically rewarding you, right? And when they started making automatically reward characters, Sigma, Brig, BAP, that's when the game went downhill. 5v5 triples down on that style of design for heroes, and it's not healthier for the game.
She hasn't got another bubble, or to take that risk and chase further. This also gives her dynamism against dive and Mei-based compositions too. Dive-based comps, because it means that if Zarya lives, she can punish the dive during their downtime, and Mei-based comps, because if Zarya gets walled, unless the wall is completely flush, she has the opportunity to live through that cycle and dip. Obviously, the mobility would come at a damage cost most likely, but this gives Zarya dynamism. The bottom line I'm trying to get at here is that tank flexibility can be fixed through hero design,
That wouldn't change.
not just with tanks.
That also would not change the comps where she's bad into poke. Like it's just unnecessary.
But also supports as well. But again, to keep the scope of this video focused, I'm mainly focusing on tanks. I think the main refutation to this argument is it worth it? In other words, how realistic and fixable is this? Hero designs and reworks can take ages to implement. I mean, it took Hog 7 seasons to get a new ability that, let's be real, doesn't even do all that much, and people are still split on the Sombra rework. My counter to this counter is that hero design is a one and done fix, but balance isn't. In other words, balance is something you constantly tweak, but hero design is something that, if done right, you never really have to worry about again. It's why I say in my hero guides, unless a hero gets a rework, the advice still applies, because the way you fundamentally play the hero isn't gonna change off number tweaks. It's balanced hero band-aids versus root cause hero design fixes. I also might be ignorant on this, but some of the ideas I've put forth shouldn't be that hard to implement, I think. I'm obviously not a game designer. I mean, for fuck's sake, I'm jobless doing a philosophy degree.
Go on LinkedIn and Indeed right now. Search up the jobs you can get with your degree. If it's more than 30k a year, I'll give you a high five.
But in my mind, adding some movement speed buff after our bubble breaks shouldn't intuitively be that hard. Also, considering how far we are into 5v5, immediately going back to 6v6 and figuring out how to balance that might be tough, at least at the start.
And that's harder than having to rework heroes like Reinhardt? No, it's not hard. It's actually really easy. Because for that format, we have 7 years of data. 7 years of data. It can be done in one patch. It is easier to balance the 6v6 format than it is to balance the 5v5 format. Immediately, it is easier. Especially for the tank role. So, like, this is just, it's silly. People, and I'm not saying he's doing this, but are we really going to act like there's not years of data? We all knew how to fix Overwatch 1. Jeff Goodman and Jeff Kaplan didn't. And their hands were tied by Kotick and them making them do Overwatch 2. They made the best patch ever in October 2020 and then immediately ruined it and abandoned the game. Everything you need to know is there. And if you ask the right people, it's really not that difficult.
Especially when some heroes like Kiriko, Queen, Ramatra, and the reworked Reinhardt feel like they've been designed or redesigned, like Reinhardt, to fit that 5v5 formula perfectly. Now into the argument from composition. Premise 1. Counter-swapping isn't just specific to tanks. Premise 2. If my tank gets counter-swapped, the rest of
What the fuck?
my team can effectively counter-swap back. Premise 3. roles that aren't tank, i.e. DPS and supports, that decide to counter-swap end up minimizing the tank counter-swap phenomena, aka rock, paper, scissors. Therefore, tank counter-swapping is no longer an issue. Now intuitively, this seems like a weird argument to make. After all, on the surface, it seems that what I'm saying is the solution to rock, paper, scissors is more rock, paper, scissors, but to different roles. But really, the crux of this argument is that when you expand the counter-swap...
That's what's happening right now. Like, DPS are the first people to counter-swap you on tank. Like, the DPS, everybody can counter-swap you. The whole lobby can counter-swap you. It's not just specific to the tank, right? Like, if you're playing Ryan and they go Mei Bastion, you need to switch, right? Even if they don't go Orisa. Unless you're DPS mirror. So, like, again, it's just, like, this format just forces it more. It's just less fun. It's that simple.
Swapping from tanks to the rest of the DPS and support cast, the game becomes significantly more dynamic. Coffee brought this up months ago, explaining how, even if Mauga directly counters Doomfist, Doom's comp as a whole can counter the Mauga comp.
Sombra Tracer
counters the Mauga comp, but Mauga as a character counters Doomfist. When Mauga is played, there has to be some form of medium to long range pressure because Mauga is going to struggle to rotate in the open without it. This basically means that the Mauga comp has some element of poke, which means that there are people that Doomfist is able to hit. Because Mauga struggles to rotate in general as a character as well, Doomfist is very good at hitting people midway through their rotations very, very early, as well as getting out. To be honest, the only real reason why I describe Mauga as a Doomfist counter is because Mauga looks to draw. Obviously, in the short range, Mauga's time to kill is absolutely insane. But if the Doomfist does have a team or a team composition that actually allows him to get in and get out consistently, Doom is not a bad matchup for Mauga.
There's plenty of examples of this. Zarya vs Sigma, for example. Zarya's better into Sigma, but Sigma may comp destroy Zarya. Zarya vs Winston too.
Zarya is not better into Sigma, by the way. Especially on the Sig maps.
Zarya loses to Winston, sure, but if you're playing Zarya Reaper or Zarya Bastion, that becomes a lot more feasible. Just yesterday, there was a clear-cut example of this, with Ex Oblivione running Winston into Twisted Minds Mauga on Blizzard World. Mauga destroys Winston, so how and why is EXO running Winston? When you expand the game beyond the tanks, the game automatically becomes a lot more about how you play rather than what you play, and as talked about prior, that usually makes the game more fun. Now I can't speak for Chase, the Winston player in this example, in terms of how much fun he's having, but I can almost guarantee he's having more fun playing into Mauga when the rest of his team is suiting his playstyle instead of a ranked...
Exactly, in pro play. But in ranked, that never happens. And now... this counter-swapping actually affects players at low-level play, where the OP tank synergies never affected those types of players. They were playing Ryan Zarya and Prime Double Shield meta now, right? But because the stats of the solo tank have been buffed up so much, right, from whether it be their damage, their ability strength, whatever it may be, right, the matchups that were unfavorable at the skill floor are even stronger now and easier to execute. So a problem that really was only affecting high-ranked players has now been given to the entire player base in terms of swapping, because they never had to really do that. So again, like, this is pro play. Sure, they can do that, but this never happens in the actual game. It really doesn't even happen in top 500 either.
Environment where randos are picking whatever they want to. I think there's two main refutations to this argument. Firstly, and I've already mentioned this beforehand, someone might say, you're not fixing counter-swapping, you're just shifting it to the supports and DPS. But again, I think this refutation is relatively weak for two main reasons.
And again, like, it's like you never want to like get rid of like picking the right comp will always give you an advantage, right? But you don't want it to be the most deciding factor of the game. Like right now, making the right swaps is the most deciding factor of the game. It's the most important thing, right? Like, and it's so easy to get enormous value out of it because of how this design stuff works and how the format works. So, like, again, it's never gonna go away in 6v6, right? But in 6v6, like, it was way more about like how you played rather than what you picked, and that's why, again, the format's better.
Any team game ever made, including 6v6 Overwatch, responsibility is not held in a single role. You could say that I'm shifting the counter-swapping responsibility to the supports and DPS, but the same happened with 6v6, just onto the off-tank instead. If we're playing Ryan Zarya against something pokey, like Ashe, Zen, Ana, Sigma, it's partially on my off-tank to swap to D.Va. Now in 5v5, not only do you as Reinhardt have more agency, but that responsibility... If we're playing Ryan Zarya against something pokey, like Ashe, Zen, Ana, Sigma, it's partially on my off-tank to swap to D.Va. Now in 5...
Yeah, but you also had the option of switching your Ryan to Monkey and playing double bubble, right? There were more choices, and the choices were actually in those players' hands, right? That's the big difference. There was also a frontline exchange that allowed you to be more efficient than the optimal picks more consistently, right? It's so much harder to do that now, and that's the whole point, right? There's a part of it that was there, but there were so many different ways that you as a player could answer it via gameplay rather than just switching to the correct hero.
5v5, not only do you as Reinhardt have more agency, but that responsibility just goes to your supports to go Lucio, and your DPS to go Mei to wall off the rotations, or to go Symmetra, or to go a powerful hit scan, whatever the situation requires. Secondly, when you disperse responsibility away from the tank role and into the rest of the team comp, the game becomes so much more dynamic. Obviously, we should try to design tanks in such a way where they have multiple viable playstyles to avoid the fate of
How does the game become more dynamic, right? It's like, again, you could say the same thing about 6v6, but it's better, right? 6v6 does the same thing but better because the tank players have a meaningful frontline exchange with the other tanks that makes the game more dynamic. Like, that's not a 5v, that's not like a hero design thing, right? That's a 5v5 or 6v6 thing. I could say the same thing about 6v6 but better. So like, yeah, 5v5, I guess you could say could do that. But again, the tank player's experience is still worse because there's not a meaningful way for them to do it unless they switch. It just makes for a worse experience for 99% of players. Like a scrim environment, maybe. But like the rest, what about the entirety of the player base here? Like nobody is arguing this for the casuals, which is crazy. It's crazy that I have to be the one to do that, even though I've been like, high ranked forever. It's just, people just, they're not addressing like the actual crux of it. But
paper, scissors, as I previously argued. But to reduce the game to just this tank 1v1, where the other 8 heroes aren't playing a factor to how you play yourself, is a little bit short-sighted in my opinion. I think the best refutation to this argument is the reliance on your own team to solve the issue. It just doesn't feel great, nor is it fun, having to rely on random ranked teammates to not just pick the right heroes, but also know how to play them, just to make your own experience more playable. This I'll concede because it is a good counterpoint, but I will say that Overwatch is a team game. You will have to rely on your teammates eventually, both in ranked and especially in team play. Now onto the third argument, which basically evaluates everything I've said in this video. This doesn't really require its own premises and conclusions, because I'm assuming Samito's original argument is correct. All I'm doing is asking the question, does it even matter? It sounds kinda silly, but let's look at the bigger picture here. The example Sam used in that video, aka the Flat Stronger Town game, was a game in the top 0.1% of the player base, if not higher, and is only one game out of many. This game that Sam reacts to is a game where both tanks are at their skill ceiling, or very close to it. But in your average Plat games, players are nowhere near the skill ceiling of their heroes. Therefore, instead of counter-swapping, they should actually learn to master the skill ceiling of their hero, because it's actually beneficial to them in the long run. This might sound like, oh, it's a skill issue for heads. But think about it, if you're a gold tracer player who's not playing the hero properly, and you don't have fun as a result, is that a problem with the hero tracer, or is that a problem with you, the player? Likewise, if you're playing D.Va into Zarya, and you're sitting main the entire game, getting beamed, is that an issue with the D.Va, or an issue with the player?
Yes, it's an issue with D.Va. Because in 5v5, if you are the only tank, your options to play the game properly are extremely one-dimensional in the gameplay loop. The argument that, oh, it's only the top-level players, like, again, this happens in every rank now. In every rank. Because previously, again, when it was tank synergies that were OP, you actually had to have execution to make a tank oppressive or be favored in the matchup. But now, because all of those abilities and power have been given directly to the tank's abilities and health pool and damage, right? The execution requirement to get value out of that is significantly lower, which now means it actually affects the skill floor as much as the skill ceiling, which also leads to the very snowbally matchmaker, right? Where if you get the wrong tank, or your tank is feeding, or your tank is making mistakes, the game is auto over. Because now, if that was one of your tanks in 6v6 that was making that mistake, right? Like the other 2 tanks on the other team were not super powered tanks, right? They were just normal tanks that actually had weaknesses, which means you as a DPS player or a support player had a pretty good chance of punishing them, right? It was doable. But now when your super tank is feeding or on the wrong pick or doing whatever, the game's just over. I shouldn't say it's just over. It's way more likely that that game is just over, which is why you see people complaining about snowball matches more in this game than you did in Overwatch 1. So, like, again, it's got nothing to do with the actual player's skill level. By design, picking the right tank against the right matchup rewards you significantly more in this format at every level of play than it did previously. So it's got nothing to do with the skill level. And go ask any Plat tank player or Gold tank player. I see so many comments saying the same thing, right? I proved this in my unranked GM Orisa, where I was playing against Zarya, and the second that player swapped Zarya, it was either in Plat or Diamond, right? My ability to carry the game got significantly lower, and you could just tell. I was running the lobby. I was significantly better than every other person on that team. But because my teammate did not go Bastion, if I tried to force Orisa, my output was significantly lower. And that never would have happened in Overwatch 1. It would have been way less. And my actual decision-making would have been way more impactful. But again, because the Zarya can double bubble himself and he has more health, right? Instead of using one bubble and being vulnerable after, even if he does pierce my spear as Orisa, if he made a misplay with his cooldown, I could go kill him, right? If I read the cooldowns right, could be fine. But because I now have to go through 2 bubbles and he has more health, even if I bait him into making a mistake with our exchange, my ability to punish him is significantly lower in this game. So again, it's not about how I play, it's about what I picked. And this is across every skill level. And all tank players have started to pick up on this. So it's the skill level argument for at least the tank role. It's not nearly as impactful.
Now, if you're playing D.Va into Sim, Mei, Ram, where there's almost no playstyle for you to choose from, then I could see your POV. But even then, those cases are extremely marginal, and if you are playing D.Va into Sim, Mei, and Gold, you can outskill those players because they're not even a quarter way up their maximum skill ceiling. Now, that's not to say that counts.
Yeah, but neither are you, right? And again, like, people in the average ranks just want to play what they want to play. And so if they're getting constantly counter swap now in this game and they're actually forced to switch way more, it's a worse gameplay experience. That's the entire point.
Don't exist, or that they make the game less fun to play. I mean, trust me, D.Va into Sim Mei is not that fun, but the existence of counter-swapping doesn't always mean that dynamics and playstyles are cut from the game. Coach OC explains the nuance well in this clip here.
Now this actually means that Awkward is absolutely right, in the sense that you need to know how to play into counters. That is important to allow you to win games, but Awkward is also wrong, because if you don't end up swapping in some circumstances, it will place you and your team at an active disadvantage for an extended period of time. If counters weren't real, professional teams would play whatever they wanted, but the fact is that counters are real. We run certain heroes for a good reason. We will swap in different scenarios to try and counter enemy compositions, and we adapt as well as we can because the fact is that money is on the line, and we will do what is necessary to win. If the people who have the money on the line are counter swapping, I can guarantee to you that it is real and it is necessary. On the flip side, though, Awkward is also right about the fact that relying on counter-swapping can sometimes hold a player back. You may be placing yourself on heroes you are uncomfortable with, or you could be stretching your hero pool too thin.
In summary, counter-swapping does exist. Counter-swapping can be unfun, counter-swapping can reduce how dynamic the game feels. But let's not act like there aren't fixes to counter-swapping, namely hero design, or that there aren't ways to mitigate counter-swapping specifically.
Yeah, you're right. He's right, though. He is right. I'll give him this. You're right, man. Counter-swapping wouldn't matter if you just design every hero to be the same. Just design every hero to be very similar, Forehead. Then counter-swapping won't matter. Okay, congratulations. You've destroyed the identity of the tank role even more. All the fan-favorite heroes, the unique interactions, the unique play styles that made Overwatch fun and beautiful are now gone from the game. And you've destroyed the entire identity of the game. Nice. We've done it. This is my entire point. Yes, if you design every hero, the fact that the only answer is to make every hero one-dimensional and very similar is the problem. That is the best 5v5 has to offer. So yes, let's acknowledge the problem. The 5v5 role lock format. And this is really important for the devs to understand before it's too late, right? Before you try to rework Reinhardt, right? Ask yourself, is this actually better? Does this build on what made Overwatch great? Or does it take away from what made Overwatch great? At least with the tank role, we all know the answer. It's worse. Significantly worse, right? So, yeah.
Specifically for tanks, through looking at the composition more holistically. There's a valid point to be made that counter-swapping does make the game less fun, for both parties involved, and it's why the ultimate takeaway from this video is that certain tank heroes who don't have many flexible, dynamic, or interactive playstyles need to be reworked to lower their strengths, but to cover their weaknesses. Kind of what OC said at the end of his TikTok clip. As always, let me know if you liked this style of video, and if there's any other videos.
Yeah, so I'm glad he came to this conclusion because the conclusion he came to is actually a worse game. Like, the answer is to make Overwatch worse. That's the answer. What made Overwatch so beautiful was all the dynamic different ways you could play the game that were fun. But guess what? Even if you rework every character to be the same, that solo tank player is still going to get swapped into constantly. Is still going to take the brunt of all the cooldowns constantly. Is still going to have a one-dimensional gameplay loop without any room to expand. Won't have very meaningful frontline exchanges. We'll have these swapping issues be at the skill floor instead of only at the skill ceiling. It is a worse game. Straight up. It just is. So I'm glad I actually reacted to this video. Like, in a way, he's actually arguing for 6v6, right? And I'm glad that people are finally coming to that conclusion. Because when you come to that conclusion, then take a step back and say, wait a minute, so we have to make all heroes really be the same and fill the same role, then they're not the heroes they were when the game was great. They're not dynamic, right? They're not special. They're not unique. It limits how you can design characters instead of making fun, new, unique ones that fill a niche that allow players to expand on how to play the game. You are more limited. You're not more free. It's not better. So I'm glad I reacted to this. I think he just argued for, he really just proved my point. This is my entire point about the game. And I hope that the devs see this and ask themselves before they jump off and can't go back, right? It's not too late yet. It is easier to have the 5v5 tanks fit into 6v6 than it is to rework the 6v6 tanks that are fan favorites, staples that people will not want touched to work in 5v5. It's just, it's too hard. It's not better, okay? It's not too late. So yeah, that's my reaction to this video. Definitely an interesting one. Yeah, I will see you guys later. Take care. Peace out.